So it looks like I am closing out the day. It's been a whirlwind experience today. A lot of great presentations, um, and so I've learned quite a bit. And that's what our organization is about is learning about the various different issues and topics and how we can use that information to help us with our mission, and that is to protect the public's right to clean water in the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. And, we do that by stopping pollution to promote safe drinking water, protect healthy river habitats, and enhance public use and enjoyment. A lot of times, though, we are at a disadvantage, though, in trying to develop our programs and highlight what's important for our watershed and for our river systems, because a lot of times the public doesn't or is not really aware of all the issues, and especially PFAS. It's there's very little information that gets disseminated out to the public on PFAS. It's a very difficult concept for the general population to understand because we're talking small, minute amounts of pollution that has an impact on aquatic organisms and on us as a whole. And there's been some great information shared today, and I'm really looking forward to diving into some of the other sources of pollution throughout the entire Potomac watershed that Jennifer had in her PowerPoint. So I'm really interested in getting that information to kind of really dive into it, because we know that there's more sources of PFAS than just your typical AFFF locations, which has been identified in a number of different, online databases. We also know that municipal and county landfills have PFAS, especially some of our older landfills that may not have the impermeable barriers and a state-of-the-art leachate collection system, and where these are 20, 30-year-old landfills that have been closed down for a while, and we've had a number of those have problems. And PFAS was never among the pollutants that were tested to see what kind of releases in going from those landfills into the environment. So landfills are definitely a concern. And then obviously we have some industrial sites as well. So I am the Upper Potomac Riverkeeper. And we do have a number of other river keepers in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. There's 13 of us. Here with the Potomac Riverkeeper Network, there's myself and Mark Fondorf, Shenandoah Riverkeeper, and Dean Nyax, who's the Potomac Riverkeeper. So we all have our own areas of expertise and information that we're kind of diving into. And I have spearheaded the PFAS pollution issue here in the Upper Potomac for the organization, more as a research and understanding of how this pollution issue is impacting our watershed, starting from the Upper Potomac area, but we are doing a lot of work in the other areas of the Potomac watershed. So just a little real quick, I'm going to walk you through how this came about for our organization. And obviously everyone knows about the 2016 EPA drinking water guidance of 70 parts per trillion. That really kind of pushed things to a head, even though PFAS has been in our environment and basically in our blood for the past 40 to 50 years, ever since it was developed. But when this drinking water occurred, it triggered some things. And first and foremost, up here in the Upper Potomac, Martinsburg, Big Springs Water Treatment Plant in West Virginia, it was above that 70 parts per trillion level, had to be shut down. And that source was trying to figure out where the source of that Big Springs treatment and where the PFAS is coming from. And it was identified through some West Virginia DEP sampling as the 167th Air National Guard was the source. And they've used AFFF for decades and decades in their military training, fire extinguishing exercises, which got into the groundwater and as a plume has migrated and impacted the springs there for the drinking water. And so this is pretty much how things got started, but I wasn't aware of this issue springing up in this area until uh, probably late in 2017. And, that's when I started to understand, all right, something's going on. We need to kind of investigate this and try and get a little bit more of a handle on it. The sampling that was done by West Virginia DEP was only done one time, and I wanted to get, a little bit more of a second opinion on this. And so we've done some sampling in 2019 in the West Virginia area, and I'll share those results here in a minute. But moving further in the timeline, in 2019, the CDC and Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry did a PFAS exposure assessment in the Martinsburg area, and I'll share some of those results. But further on in 2019, after our initial sampling that we had done in several of the places in West Virginia around the National Guard base, the Air National Guard did release their environmental monitoring report. And in that report were some alarming numbers, and mainly the groundwater assessment at one of the highest levels that I've seen in a while in this area is 126,000 parts per trillion of PFOA and PFOS in the groundwater plume underneath the facility, which has, migrated into some of the spring fed streams in that area. Just kind of going back real quick, this PFAS exposure, just want to tell you a little bit about this. 275 people were tested, 165 households were tested, their blood, the urine were tested. There was some environmental assessments at some of the homes, collecting dust samples and looking at carpets. And there was also some surveys that they were conducted, like how much water do they normally drink? Do they eat fish from local rivers and streams? And a lot of that information was calculated. And some of the highlighted results from this are the fact that the PFOS and PFHXS in the blood were higher than the national average. And you can see some of the other levels as well, PFOA and PFNA in there. Not as high, but still significant. And this just created this cause for concern, and it really wanted us to start asking some questions. And so diving into some of the sampling that we did sample USGS well there in Leetown, and we sampled a couple other private wells, and the results were around 2 to 6 parts per trillion PFAS when we did that sampling. And another time, USGS well, the same USGS well, we only got about 1 parts per trillion. And now this well was much further south of the base. You can see in the graphic, it's way down there by Leetown, and the base is way up in the northern section. And so the plume primarily stayed right around the base area. And so that's why we started to think about the spring-fed streams, Evans Run and Cold Spring Run. And we did some sampling there. And Cold Springs runs closer to the base and therefore registered much higher, 1,480 parts per trillion. And you can see some of the other levels there at Evans Run. And what was interesting too is those are the same exact sites that the Air National Guard did some of its off-base monitoring, and they came up with very similar results. And so, we started asking this question: if it's in the water, is it in the fish? And we all know, from today's lessons that for sure, yes, it's in the fish. But back then, it was still a question. It was still a question that we had. There wasn't a whole lot of information. And so following this path of trying to figure out what's going on, I reached out to Vicki Blazer. She and I and Potomac Riverkeeper Network has had a really good working relationship over the years. And I said, hey, Vicki, do you have any fish samples in the Pecan Creek, which is the recipient of those 2 small streams from the base? And she said, no, but I have some smallmouth bass samples that I just hot off the presses from the Antietam Creek. And she shared that information with me. I was very lucky that she was able to share that with me before she even produced any certified reports. So I'm very thankful for that. And that just kind of gave me some information. Look, these 6 PFAS compounds were analyzed in the blood plasma, and you can see some of the results that were ranging from 220,000 to 574,000 parts per trillion PFOS. To me, that just was like, oh my gosh, this is extremely high. And, if it's in the blood plasma, it's going to be in the fish tissue. And I know for a fact there are many folks in my area of the watershed that catch fish and eat the fish, whether it's for sustenance reasons, or if it's a cultural reason or low income reason. I do know that it happens and occurs quite a bit. And so that was a big question. Um, you know, the other question is why is it so high? Why is it so high in the Antietam Creek? And there were no obvious chemical manufacturers of PFAS. There were no obvious large industrial users that I was aware of in first research on this. And so it was like, okay, so what can we test for and where can we test to find out what's going on in the Antietam Creek? Also recognizing the fact that smallmouth bass do have a large geographical habitat. And so these fish that have the results were caught at the mouth of the river. And so, looking at the Antietam Creek, we collected some samples in 2020. We tested 11 PFAS compounds, including PFOS and PFOA. And we tested Hagerstown wastewater treatment plant, the effluent discharge, the Smithsburg wastewater treatment plant effluent discharge, and the Antietam Creek itself right there at Burnside Bridge, where there is a USGS gauge station. And you can see some of the results. This is the sum of the PFAS analytes that we tested for: 138 parts per trillion in Hagerstown, 81.8 parts per trillion PFAS in Smithsburg. And there's a big difference between these two different wastewater treatment plants besides just size and volume. It's what's being put into it. There's a whole lot more commercial, and there's some industrial users that are discharging into the Hagerstown wastewater treatment plant. But in the Smithsburg wastewater treatment plant, it is 95% residential and very, very little commercial, very small, maybe mom and pop type of commercial facilities. So, when that started, really begged the question, how is the PFAS getting into such a residential? And I think we all know the answer to that. We have a lot of products that we use that's PFAS in there, and that the public isn't really aware. And so they're excreting it because they're eating it, or they're washing it down the drain, or they're shampoo and soaps and laundry detergent and that kind of thing. That's what's getting into the system and then getting into our rivers and streams. And so it really begged the question, if these two small rural cities have such a large impact of PFAS in their waste stream, then what about all the other larger wastewater treatment plants in the watershed? Remind you, this was a few years ago. We're just getting into all of this. We're really trying to learn everything else, and I've learned a whole lot more since then. And at the same time, we're looking at the Hagerstown wastewater treatment plant. Right next to it is the Synagro facility. It's capturing some of that sludge from the wastewater treatment plant, combine it with other sludge from across the state and probably other states, and then using that and creating biocells that are spread in farm fields. So, then the second question was, continuing questioning was, what about levels in sludge? And here's a real quick look at the levels from our monitoring that we did in Antietam Creek. And you can see with the Smithsburg, there really wasn't any PFOS detected, but there was, a fair, decent level of PFOA. Um, there's how we got the sum of our analysis. Also, we did, just some basic calculations because we were able to sample at the stream right next to a USGS gauge station. We can utilize some basic loading calculations, and, looking at some loadings at the Antietam Creek itself at the time when we collected the samples, which is 300 cubic feet per second. We're looking at 7.67 pounds of PFAS being delivered from the Antietam into the Potomac watershed. Where is that on the spectrum of good, bad, or ugly? That remains to be seen. But to me, at that time, it seemed a bit alarming. And similarly with the Hagerstown wastewater treatment plant, comparing, an average annual discharge compared to a rain event discharge, and that's from the area there. So you have 4.2 to 12.6 pounds per year. loading coming from Hagerstown, and then only 0.08 and 0.15 pounds per year from the Smithsburg. So obviously the smaller system, smaller levels, smaller amounts, but still, when you compound that with all the other waste streams, can be significant. So this got us the question about biosolids. We've gone from groundwater, we've gone from wastewater, we've gone into fish and trying to figure out what's going on in the fish. And then now we're trying to, pose the question about biosolids. So a lot of great information today in the presentations, but doing just some real quick assessments on PFAS here in Maryland. And where PFAS is and where it's coming in. There's a lot of information. There's some information out there in the background from FDA, tested a variety of foods for PFAS. It's found in milk, meat, seafoods, grains, and produce. We have farms contaminated with PFAS from biosolids: Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, Alabama, Florida. It's found in soils, it's cows and the farmer's blood. You have been here recently. There was an advisory of beef from Michigan Cattle Farm in January 22nd. So, we have a number of sources and issues and problems with biosolids. And
2-minute warning there, Brent.
2-minute warning. Got it. Thank you. So we looked at where is biosolids being applied to in Maryland, and 72% in 2018 was agriculture. And then looking at land application in Maryland, we have 1,507 permits since 1988. 225 permits are active right now. The highest being Frederick, Charles, and Allegheny County. They're allowed to grow corn, hay, and have grazing cattle. And to me, this is a bit of a concern, just because there is potential transfer of PFAS into that corn, which then can be used into feed, into hay, which then can go into our other animals for processing, or directly into cattle from grazing. But you can see a reduction in the number of applications over the years, which is a good thing, but we're still concerned that it's not being assessed. So we're going to take some steps, and we've identified a couple of sites that we have collected samples to test for PFAS from rain event stormwater discharge without any other interfering potential sources. We're using a new company called CycloPure, which is a much cheaper way of analyzing and looking at PFAS. However, we're not really sure of its resilience and comparability with other EPA methods. So we might be using that method as just a trigger to see if we need to do further analysis. That way it's a lot cheaper for us, since we are a lean and mean fighting machine. And and so we might follow up with much more rigorous monitoring and testing. So priorities, like everything has been stated today, we have got to look for ways to stop the cycle. We really have to do that. We have to really implement the drinking water regulations. I think there's enough information out there from other states, and now with EPA and these new MCLs that are being proposed, it's about time that our states kind of just take the plunge and start issuing these drinking water regulations. And we really got to push the envelope. I know Maryland's doing a pretty good job, but we have a lot of other states that need to really push the envelope in assessing and developing an action plan, because we know that there's going to be a huge cost for that treatment, and we don't want to pass that cost on to the consumers. But we got to find a way to where it's going to help get rid of some of this problem. And then, the disposal of the filter media. Great presentation on that. I'm really diving into more of that. Land application of biosolids, that's going to be a big sticky point for us. We're going to look at ways to try and see how we can assess it and eventually ban it, but then at what level? And we really have to understand, at least in my area of the watershed, we have karst geology. Karst geology is a whole nother factor, but there's more exposure from things being land applied in karst geology that can get into our subsurface groundwater and into our drinking water facilities. And then fish consumption advisories is another specific priority of ours. This is the last slide, and legislative actions we've done. The George Walter Taylor Act stops the use of PFAS in rugs, carpets, foods packaging, AFFF, and restricts the disposal of products with PFAS. We're focused on fish collection on the Apecan Creek to develop fish consumption advisories in West Virginia. And again, like I talked about, the biosolids land application sites and assessment. We've done a number of other things, but I think I'm running out of time. And I would just want to stress to all the states that we really have to do a much better job of developing a public awareness, either through social media or other venues, trying to educate the public on what PFAS is. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brent. As we look forward to next steps, I'd like to ask the former ICPRB Chair, Lee Currey, for some of his thoughts on continuing the conversation on PFAS. Lee?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to wrap this up. And I want to thank folks that have been with us throughout the entire day. I know there was a lot of information. I think in terms of thinking about what's next, it's important to look back a couple of years. And this conference was really born out of the strategic plan that was put together for ICPRB. It goes from 2020 out to 2023. And if you look at the mission of ICPRB, protect and enhance the waters and related resources through science, regional cooperation, and education, and then thinking about the action identified in the strategic plan, which is really to hold and host this PFAS conference and this PFAS conversation, because I really like the way it was phrased in terms of a conversation, which I believe is what we had today. I think, well, I know the planning committee, really nailed it on this. So I think I just want to give kudos to the planning team. I want to thank the speakers. There was a broad spectrum of interest and topics ranging from science to implementation. And I also want to thank the attendees also for their time and their questions today. And I suspect that we all have unique takeaways from all the various topics today, and it's going to be different depending on where we are. Whether we're in a state agency, whether we're advocating through a organization, or we're doing research. I'll try to do this from a commissioner perspective, but maybe also from a state perspective in terms of some of the implications that I heard from today. And I think the takeaway is similar to what we understood in Maryland, is that, okay, PFAS is in the basin. There are areas of elevated levels. It's probably not everywhere, but there are areas of concern and areas of concern that need additional attention in forms of whether it's remediation, education, and whatnot. I also think, starting out the conversation today and hearing from other states on the panel, EPA's interim health advisory really threw us a curveball. That's just my experience. It was, and I think Lisa expressed it well. It's, we had a health advisory. We had reference doses, toxicology information, reference doses and toxicity information. Sorry. And now I think, from my perspective, I'm grappling. We've been grappling at, okay, well, now the interim health advisory is kind of like an MCL goal, and I think we in Maryland, we were trying to figure out how to best apply that. And we're just trying to make the best decisions that we can with the information we have. We have a sense of maybe where it will land, but nonetheless, it has made things a bit more challenging for us. Environmental justice, something that the commission is very focused on also, is a critical part of this, because from what we've seen, we have some rural areas where we're finding, Brent was just showing that, elevated levels, as well as rural areas with either shallow wells or unconfined aquifers for their water supply. And it's going to be a matter of how do we best target resources to them and make that an effective strategy for communication. So I think we're all going to face that issue. And I think from the when we think about the basin states, we're all moving forward. I think we're at different stages. You know, some are maybe further ahead, and some are collecting information, and I wouldn't say catching up, but I really would phrase it as that we're all moving forward. We're all engaged. I think that's critical, is that we're all engaged and we're all making progress, and we recognize the urgency and seriousness of this issue. And I think we're all facing similar challenges. Risk communication being at the top of the list in terms of how we talk with the public, how we talk with utilities about the actual risk of PFAS and the pathways of exposure, whether through fish consumption or drinking water, or keep in mind that the relative source contribution for the drinking water health advisory is 20%. So 80% is the assumption is coming from somewhere else, and the interim health advisory, kept that same assumption. And I think we're also, it was great to hear today about the remediation techniques and what's being advanced in terms of science. Also, one takeaway for me is that there's a lot of coordination that's occurring. I think the coordination today was valuable. Also, there's a lot happening within the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, within the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, within each of the states. So I think it's important from here moving forward, that we continue to carry on this conversation. There was so much information presented today on a variety of topics. One thing I'm hoping is that, and would recommend, is that ICPRB actually put this information up on a website somewhere, so that we can look back and access, the variety of slides that we saw today, because there was a lot of data, a lot of information, some information that I hadn't seen before. So I think that's helpful for us to go back and look at that. In my mind, this was a success. I really learned a lot, appreciated the engagement, and I think it's something that the commission should continue to do and host on an annual basis as part of I believe it falls under the plan under the annual Potomac River Conference, but this is an important issue. And I think the justification for that is that there's continued interest in all of us, and a continued role that ICPRB plays, whether it's the science and the common interest we have on the ecosystem impacts and fish consumption, for example. There's a lot of information being collected right now, and in my mind, we don't fully know what the implications of that are yet. So it's important for us to convene and get together and have that conversation about that area. And I think that's also goes in alignment with all the data that's being collected. There's the opportunity to kind of align it or bring it together, and convene in terms of what does, not just what data exists, but what does it mean, and what does it mean to us as decision makers in terms of moving forward. I think there's a tremendous amount of work with drinking water activities through the states. So I think that's another reason to, again, come back and coordinate to see where we all are. I think looking at EPA proposing an MCL by the end of this calendar year, next year is going to be interesting in terms of the comments that come back from that. So I think, again, there's a lot that we can continue to talk about. And I think as we come back next year for a conference, talking more about our risk communication and our efforts there, and maybe successes and challenges would be helpful. So I think, again, it was very, from my perspective, it really accomplished what, as commissioners, as a commissioner, what I thought the Basin Commission was going to do. And I think it's really an important step forward, and something, again, that Mike, I recommend continuing into the future. So Mike, I guess there's a little bit of time left, and let me turn it over back to you, from carrying on this conversation and your thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lee. Stephanie, do we have I think we have time for one more question, sort of a wrap-up question. Is there something in the chat that fits the bill?
Hello. At the moment, we don't have any questions for this section.
Okay. Well, I'll wrap us up then. And I'd like to thank the ICPRB Conference Committee as well, Christina Davis, Renee Barassa, Curtis Dalbra, Stephanie Newmer, and Heidi Maltz. I'd also like to thank all the speakers today. I think it was a fabulous conference. And I want to point out, though, that funding for this conference has been organized and executed with funding from ICPRB's Clean Water Act Section 106 funding from EPA. We are proud of our partnership with EPA and with all of the basin jurisdictions. As the former chair, Lee Currey, had noted, that we want to make this Potomac River Conference an annual event. So please send some ideas our way so that we can start our planning process for next year. My last words are that, as I said, the first time I heard about PFAS was in 2019. And I think all of us have learned so much since that time. I think all of our speakers gave a great point of view and perspective from their work and the willingness to share with the group. And that's what we're all about here at ICPRB is coordinating and bringing people together to share information. Our entire DNA has been premised on the fact that we are not somebody who keeps information close to the vest. We want to share it with everybody. So with that, I think we are ready to adjourn, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. So the conversation is not over. The PFAS conversation continues, and thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.